Okay, welcome everyone. It looks like we've gone live. Our host has kicked off the session, so that's excellent. Welcome everyone back to our second our second webinar here in the COMET webinar series. For those of you that are perhaps just logging on, or again watching this in the recording at a later date. For those of you that don't know me, my name's as it says there, my name's Craig Smith, Head of Operations and Learning and Development here at COMET. And yeah, we're delighted to bring you another short, hopefully short but useful, interesting webinar within the series that we've set up for 2024. For those of you that joined us around 3 weeks ago or so on our very first webinar of the series, that of course was looking at the benefits of root cause analysis and specifically around COMET, looking at how the COMET route maps and the structure and all of that works within the COMET system. So again, as I've said, we've opened up these webinars to both existing COMET users and organizations, and of course anyone else out there who thinks that they might benefit from some useful insight into what we're going to be covering. As you can see, the plan today is we're going to take a little bit of a look through the lens of understanding human error, and a little bit of a kind of provocative opening line there. The lazy root cause, and we'll get into some of that as we run through today's session. And again, just to keep you up to date with things, on the 16th of December, we have our final webinar of this year, and that will be looking at fundamentals and best practice around data gathering techniques and how to respond effectively when things don't go to plan. And as a reminder as well, going into 2025, we will have it looks as though we're going to have around 8 webinars throughout the course of the year, starting late February, early March, right through until the end of beginning of December. And again, we've identified 8 individual themes that again will hopefully be of use. So again, we'll be in a position to share these hopefully in the next few weeks. So let's get into the topic for today then, the understanding human error, the lazy root cause, and actually why understanding human error should come at the very beginning of your investigation, or certainly during the investigation process, not simply at the very end. So what we mean by that, of course, is that, and we see it a lot, human error being identified as the outcome or the sole outcomes of why we suffered an incident or a loss or some kind of unplanned event. And quite frankly, that's not necessarily fair or always the truth. Now, I'm not going to say that human error doesn't have a role to play. Of course it does. And I'm going to introduce a slide in part of my opening introductory slides today that will give some reasonably interesting stats and figures around human error in different industries in different parts of the world. And you might find those a little bit insightful. So what we're saying here, of course, is that human error, ultimately, and this might be a little bit controversial in our world, but mistakes and errors, these things are inevitable. They will happen. And what we're trying to shine a light on with today's webinar series is really about understanding, typically within organizations, typically within the work that we do, what are the common error traps that we might actually be designing in as opposed to designing out. And how do all of these things influence our behaviors and our decision making on any given day? So I'm not going to sit here for the next 50 minutes or so and say that we should not pay close attention to human error, or that people should never be held responsible or accountable for actions. Of course, there's a time and a place for these things, but at the true heart of investigations, at the true heart of learning, to try and do our best to manage human error and understand typically where these errors manifest themselves from, then we've got to go into these investigations and almost have that culture within the organization of truly understanding the why, and from there we can actually move on. So hopefully we'll all be able to grasp and take away some of that from today's session. So traditionally speaking then, and this provides a pretty solid foundation, I suppose, for today, and we could all, probably relate to this. And in fact, those of you that are signing up or watching this that are currently using COMET, you will recognize all of these phrases and statements from within our human factors integrate module. Human action, or indeed inaction, which results in an unexpected and unwelcome outcome. And we quite often categorize these as mistakes and slips and lapses and violations. And to the untrained eye, you might be thinking, well, what's the difference and what do these things actually mean? It's a lot of fancy key words. But actually, open source, there's a lot of definitions and examples. But in the COMET sense, I will touch on these in a little bit more detail later on about our traditional, I suppose, understanding of what we mean by human error. So these things are not wrong, but actually, I want to try and flip that view a little bit, and I want us to think about human error a little bit differently. So our preferred definition, actually, about treating human error is an unexpected opportunity to better encourage the learning that might come from them. So if we just take a moment and pause, what do we think that actually means then? An unexpected opportunity. So it's still relating back to the fact that it probably shouldn't have happened, or we certainly weren't expecting it to happen. But as we said, human errors, and as human beings, of course, we are, we're not perfect, and we are susceptible to making mistakes and errors and rule breaking, let's say, for a variety of different reasons and influences that lead to that. More often than not, actually, with the intention of actually doing a good job. And no one, goes to their work, no one gets out of bed in the morning, with the intention of hurting themselves or the people around them generally. And so you kind of have to have that perspective as well. But actually, if we take the opportunity here from human error, as opposed to it being labeled simply as a violation or a mistake that should be eradicated, and perhaps that may result in an outcome where focus is put back on the human being to try and influence behavior change, how often do we actually think about, well, what actually influenced that behavior in the first place, and how can we actually learn and perhaps eradicate those influences that actually manifest themselves in human error, as opposed to just focusing on that human error or on that individual or that team on their own. So we have to try and take into account the bigger picture. So that's where we stand on this. Hopefully we can all agree on that. As I've said already, and for those of you that use COMET, you'll hopefully recognize this as well, that we're not saying that people shouldn't be left to still take responsibility for actions, particularly where perhaps decisions or actions or inactions were fairly indefensible, and there was no rational reason for them doing that. Then of course that's a slightly different set of circumstances. But where there was honesty, where there was a genuineness to try and actually do a good job here, then that's where, of course, we think there's an opportunity to actually learn, and let's encourage that to actually be the case. Because we all want to learn as organizations, we all want to get a little bit better and more efficient and safer. Well, human error is actually a great gateway into doing that, because human error, unfortunately, will probably be around till the end of time. So I mentioned as well then that we would lock in some statistics for you, and we did a little bit of research a few months ago in relation to what we wanted to talk about when it came to human error and some of the kind of underpinning, I suppose, stats and facts and figures that relate to it, and just how big a deal is it in industry, how big a deal is it in our organization, how prevalent, how real actually is. We're not wanting to just beat the old drum again about human error, but how real is the challenge that we've actually got to try and address and sort of overcome as best we can. So you can see them for yourselves. I'll just run through a couple of them there then. And actually, the one on the right-hand side I'll start off with, because we're going to explore today 2 or 3 case studies, one in particular, but I'm going to touch on 2 sort of introductory case studies shortly. And one of those actually relates to a fairly well-known aircraft disaster back in the 70s, where I think it's actually goes down in history as the world's most catastrophic airline incident in history. So 80% then of aircraft disasters actually during that investigation would have cited pilot error as the primary cause. And I don't know if anyone listening or watching has watched the film Sully, where from LaGuardia in New York, he ends up miraculously landing his jet on the Hudson River between Manhattan and New Jersey. And I believe everyone actually survived that potentially catastrophic event as well. It was a bird strike in one of the engines, I think, or maybe both engines were hit. And he didn't simply have time to get back to an airfield or get back to LaGuardia. And the retrospective investigation within that actually portrayed that he unnecessarily took that risk by landing in the Hudson. And when they did their simulator reviews, they calculated that between the moment in time they knew they had to make the decision to return to base or to get to somewhere safe, and then kicking in that action and actually performing it, they figured in the simulation that they actually had plenty of time to do that. There was actually time between when they talked about aircraft velocity and height and speed and ability to coast, that they could have actually gotten to a nearby airfield safely. However, what they hadn't factored in as part of that initial review within the investigation actually was thinking time. And it took Sully and his co-pilot X amount of time to actually decide and calculate what all of the options were, decide on what the best option was, and then make a decision that that's what they were going to do. A classic human error, or certainly a classic human factors situation to be in. And so when they factored that into the simulation, I think they added on about 30 or 40 seconds before the simulator pilot would then kick into action to replicate what Sully and co had done. It was then impossible for them to get back to a safe place or an airfield. And so it transpired that although the initial investigation was hinting toward pilot error, in actual fact, what he achieved was nothing short of a miracle. And so, sometimes when we start to look at things a little bit closer around human error, around decision making, it's amazing what can actually come out of it. So that's one example there. I will touch on another one just shortly. 75 to 90%, 6%, of marine accidents can be tracked back to human error. For some of our American colleagues that are joining us in 2022, obviously a huge industry, our healthcare and our kind of private medical industry, 250,000 American deaths in 2022 were due to some form of a medical error. 74% of data breaches involve poor human judgment. I'm sure we've all within our organizations had to undergo, cybersecurity training and learning and these sorts of things. And actually, I can recall some ones that we've done fairly recently here at COMET, and actually a lot of the training that you get, it is about how you set up safe passwords or passphrases, being careful of what you talk about, when you're in public transport, and how secure you are as an individual, but not using pen drives and the safe transfer of data. So actually, technical data breaches, quite often can be traced back to human error, human judgment as well. 90%, this is probably not too much of a surprise, 90% of traffic collisions had driver error determined as a lead cause and so on. Now, that's an interesting one, the lead cause. That's not uncommon. In fact, I would say that's actually pretty much bang on. That typically, particularly talking for here in the UK, relatively recent HSE statistics will tell us that 91% of cases of incidents and accidents in the workplace across all industry will have had human error as one of or all of the direct leading causes that led to that incident. But that's different. That's different to what we mean by a root cause. Remember, there's a big difference between something that has manifested itself into a situation or a problem that leads to an incident or an unexpected event. Now, of course, for those of you in the world of COMET, you'll understand those to be human errors, organizational shortfalls, or equipment failures. That's what we mean as a COMET factor. So it's not a surprise to hear that a high percentage of your cases will at some point have to explore human error through COMET's human factors model, or for those of you not using COMET, any other just or human factors related investigation review that you might do as well. So let's just get that clear. There is a difference between an action or an error that has directly resulted or has directly led to a bad thing happening versus the underlying root cause. Okay, the underlying root cause or root causes, of course, are these things that have generated over time and that have allowed a particular situation to exist. So we have to deal with those root and branch issues, and typically those issues will often be traced back to other factors that might sit more deep-rooted within the organization, might come back to culture, might come back to how the workplace has been designed and set up, lots and lots of things as influences, as we'll touch on shortly or later on in today's presentation, that actually leads to what that human error is. So I think it's important that we make that distinction between direct cause issues versus those underlying root causes, which are really, really important that we understand. So, to sort of summarize that, let's try and get away from the impression that human error is a root cause. If we can try and avoid that sort of mindset a little bit and understand that typically it's what leads to these human errors and what has influenced it, then we have a far better chance of longer term understanding of human error and, of course, implementing proper fixes and improvements. And I'll leave you with some guidance about how to do that shortly as well, so I won't get too far ahead of myself at the moment. But hopefully some of that sets the scene for why this topic is particularly important. Okay, a couple of introductory case studies, and then we're going to look at one in just a little bit more detail. Okay, none of us will necessarily remember this, as I'm assuming we weren't actually alive when this happened, but we'll all, of course, be aware of it. That back on the 15th of April, 1912, when the Titanic tragically sank. The captain on board, who had overall responsibility for the Titanic, of course, was Captain Edward Smith. And on the back of that disaster, and again, you know, some of us may well, of course, have an awareness of this anyway, but a lot of the initial reports and outcomes cited, unsurprisingly, human error. The captain's decision to change the ship's direction, amongst other things, resulted in the unthinkable disaster. Now, if you take a step back just for a moment and think about that, the impact, even back then, the impact that would have had on his family, on his friends, even on all of the other victims, that were on board, in terms of then, well, wow, how avoidable was this, and all the rest of it. But actually, of course, there was a lot more to it than that. And again, it comes back to this point about jumping to conclusions. When we see and we witness and we experience people doing the work that they do day to day within our organizations, it can be easy to think, well, why did you do that? But remember, quite often at the time, people do what they think is appropriate, and it would have made sense to them at the time. So try not to jump to conclusions is really important as well. And when we just take a slightly closer look at this particular example, and again, it's about trying to avoid pointing unnecessary big finger of blame, this particular case traced back to some more organizational causes within the design and understanding of the equipment and, of course, the vessel. There was a general belief, because of at the point in time, with the marvel that was the sort of mechanical and engineering solution that was the Titanic, there was this false belief actually that the ship was ultimately unsinkable, and that actually there was no way that really that this could possibly go wrong, and there was this sort of false belief that what they were doing was, or what they were operating with, was really a kind of perfect solution, and that nothing could have gone wrong. Well, clearly that wasn't actually the case, but that was dangerous. That's a dangerous mindset to be. It's that sort of mentality sometimes when you're wearing your head to toe full PPE, you almost feel you feel like Iron Man. You sort of feel that you're untouchable, and does that then set an unconscious thought process in your brain where, because you think that you're completely safe and untouchable, that you're then actually, your behaviors and your actions are then perhaps riskier than they would be if you were in the same situation wearing no PPE. The chances are, that would be yes. So yeah, that sort of false belief, that underlying current was of course there. Design flaws in the hull actually allowed these certain rivets to pop, and as a result of that allowed severe water ingress. So again, coming back to design and indeed alleged or understood to be watertight compartments, within the hull, particularly, were not watertight, and so of course the so-called unsinkable Titanic, unfortunately, was far from the truth. But it's a little bit of an example just about how the initial outcry and observation was around human error, but actually when we start to do a slightly more in-depth investigation within that, wow, there were real opportunities there to try and improve. And of course, since then, we obviously have within that particular industry. Another introductory case study. Again, this is the one that I briefly touched on earlier on. Some of you, I'm sure a lot of us were around when this particular one took place. Not me personally, I would add, but I'm sure a lot of us would have been back in 1977. The Tenerife airport disaster, 27th of March, 1977, 2 aircraft collided, and there were 583 fatalities in total. 583 fatalities across that incident, and ultimately cited down to the fact that we had issues of congestion. So this happened at the Gran Canaria airport. Had a security issue close by, where ordinarily a lot of the air traffic control in the region would have gone through. There was a security issue. I think there was a bomb threat in the area, and in actual fact, all planes in the area were being rerouted to a much smaller airport that ultimately couldn't cope with the demand. But there was no resistance to that from an airport management perspective, and so very, very quickly there was an overcrowding issue. And of course, flights coming in, flights coming out, air traffic control were overburdened, and equally to the perfect storm, so to speak. There were weather issues, a lot of fogging issues as well, which meant that visibility was very, very poor. It was very, very lacking. So the initial human error, was cited as miscommunication. Again, looking at the humans involved, between one of the captain of one of the aircraft involved, which was the KLM aircraft, and indeed air traffic control, resulting in as I've said, the world's worst in history air crash, down to the count of fatalities. But again, to avoid pointing that finger of blame unnecessarily, there were things that could have probably prevented the captain of the flight and indeed air traffic control being put into that really difficult situation that they had to manage. Some things out with their control, but some things within our control. Airport air traffic control had failed to learn from previous near-miss miscommunication failures. So whilst you had this kind of perfect storm on the day where you had the security threat, which meant you had congestion, and you also then had the deteriorating weather conditions, which of course makes that industry, air traffic control and flying, very, very difficult with the fog at ground level. There had actually been overwhelming or overriding communication issues identified in the past, which in themselves, as a precursor, had never actually led to something fortunately serious happening. But they were aware that the tightness and the control around communication between aircraft and air traffic control wasn't as effective or as high quality as it could have been. So there was an opportunity more at a systemic level from the past. So that might have led to other training or more opportunity for the skill set to be improved within those involved, particularly at air traffic control level. Authorities, as I said, had allowed the airport to become overly congested. So yeah, we do know that there was a security threat in the area, but again, that doesn't mean to say that every single aircraft in the area had to be rerouted via there. I'm sure there would have been, and if we had more time to delve into that, other opportunities potentially. So again, was the management of the situation really as effective as it could have been? And indeed, not only did we have the difficult weather conditions on the day, as it says there, but there was also equipment issues through defective runway center lights, which also made it difficult for the flight deck crews on the aircraft to be able to safely navigate through that unfamiliar airport that they were at. So again, is it as simple to say that the communication between the KLM pilot and the air traffic control caused this incident? Of course not. There were other factors involved that could have been managed better that may well have prevented this from happening. So there we go. Just a couple of introductory examples just to, again, explain a little bit around the importance of, doesn't matter how low level or minor, or in these cases that we're seeing here, how serious these incidents are. Let's think beyond the obvious human error shortcomings that may well have presented themselves and ask ourselves, well, why? What's actually influenced that? Okay, we're going to now look at a case study in a little bit more detail. Again, one even more recently that happened in Japan. And what we'll then do is we'll look at this case study in the context of COMET and looking at those error traps, looking at those performance influencing factors, and all of the things that ultimately led to what happened on the day of this particular incident and what led to that actually occurring. So again, some of you may well have an awareness of this as well. So I'll provide a little bit of incident background, a little bit more than we did in the previous two. The 25th of April 2005, a Japanese commuter train crashed, resulting in 106 fatalities and 560 other injuries, a proportion of which, of course, would have been serious as well. Now, as we'll go on to explain, for any of you, for any of us that have indeed travelled throughout in the kind of public transport system, indeed the train system in the Far East, in Japan, absolutely, I think we could all compare that to the quality sometimes of the timings of trains at home. Unfortunately, these things run to absolute clockwork, and actually culturally, it's something very, very important and close to them as well, as we will explore. So just some details then. During rush hour, heavily laden 7-car commuter train derailed whilst it was negotiating a corner. Okay. It had initially been reported. So that's the disaster. That's the initial summary of what happened. The initial reporting by the train company suggested that human error due to excess speed whilst navigating that corner was the reason for the accident. Yeah, and they explicitly blamed the driver for that and for pushing the train, I suppose, beyond its limits for that piece of track. Some other circumstances: the driver was running fractionally late and was indeed desperately trying to make up time and get back on schedule. So again, that touches back on actually the culture, not just the culture within the industry, but the culture within Japan as a country, in terms of how proud they are of that and how important that system runs on clockwork. So to be late was beyond unacceptable. The subsequent investigation, and this is one of the positive links that we can make. The subsequent investigation in the weeks and months post the disaster actually made the link between organizational context and culture and how that affected frontline behavior. And that's a big win, because that's exactly what we're talking about here. It's often about how our behavior, or how individual behavior on the front line doing the work that we do, is so strongly influenced by wider context around the work that we do, the people we work with, and the culture and the quality around leadership and management within that organization. All of these things play a role. And again, this is why it's a really good example, because it's a great case of where the initial kind of finding summary was human error, but actually, hold on a minute, there was a lot more to it than that as well, which is great that we were able to uncover that. So let's think about that then. What was that organization and more kind of cultural context? And we're going to think about these then through, in a moment, the context of our performance influencing factors. So the way that the train network or the rail network is of course set up was scheduling allowed very little capacity for late trains. Okay, so you think about that like a huge complex set of ongoing operations and different journeys. You know, one or two delays begins to have a knock-on effect. So scheduling, being on time, hugely important, as I've already touched on. As it says there, punctuality was socially demanded. It was an expectation, actually part of the culture. And lateness very much stigmatized. So reputationally not good for the rail operator, reputationally internally not very good for the driver. Erring drivers underwent very punitive and degrading punishment. So where there were issues with driver behavior, whatever that might have looked like, it became apparent that drivers were not treated fairly. They weren't treated with respect. In fact, they were almost at a point of bullying. And so, Ken, if you think about that from that perspective, how would you feel in that situation? How would anyone feel? If that's the culture within the industry, if that's a culture within the organization, that drivers who have erred in some way, who require some form of retraining, actually go through a very, very harsh, difficult process for that, and are made to feel guilty and as it says there, actually shame for what they've done. And of course, that's based on the Japanese concept of haji, where shame and embarrassment. And of course, that's something there very, very culturally important. So again, from the driver's perspective, that's the sort of situation that we're in. So the reason I'm giving you all this background is think about that in the mindset. What's the driver thinking? He's running fractionally late. He's like seconds behind. We're not talking 5 minutes. We're talking seconds here. So in his mindset, when this incident occurs, he's not thinking, he's not speeding or maybe taking a little bit of a risk because he necessarily wants to, or because that's completely the norm. He's doing it for all of these reasons that we've just explained. He's trying to do a good job. And for all of these other reasons, that really means that he does not want to be late. He does not want to go through that driver retraining. He does not want to be in that position. That's the kind of mindset at the time of the driver, more than likely. And drivers even receive financial penalties to lateness as well. So again, think about that. Financial penalties to lateness, of course, that's going to be a driver, excuse the pun, but a motivator for any driver individual to try and make sure that's not the case. And they will take risks to do that. That's just human nature. Also, there was a tight curve on the new track layout. So actually, a new piece of track layout, so a little bit less familiar to the driver. And actually, that did not have a key piece of safety critical equipment, the automatic train stop system. Which would have perhaps meant that there could have been an override in place, and perhaps the train may well have been able to have been slowed down prior to it derailing and causing the disaster that it did. But again, that piece of design wasn't in place for this piece of track either. So again, it's, as it often is with these things, it's never one thing. It's accumulation of a number of failings or shortcomings that lead to events like this, and it's almost the perfect storm. So our organizational focus was an attempt to influence driver behavior as opposed to build error resilience. Okay, so just think about what we mean by that for a second. Organizational focus was an attempt to influence driver behavior, taking risks, not wanting to be late, doing anything they can to make sure they're on time, as opposed to error resilience, i.e. building a system, through scheduling, through track design, through safety critical equipment and design on that track or on the train to actually make the driver's job easier. So i.e. let's set people up for success, let's not set people up for failure. And if we take all of that context into place here for this particular event or scenario, what do we think? Do we think that driver was set up for success based on everything, or was that driver set up for failure? Probably set up for failure. And if you think about it as well, that driver on that day made that decision. Yeah, he took a risk. But actually, if we apply the well-known in the world of human factors, the substitution test, which I'll touch on briefly later, but the substitution test means that if you take that person out of the situation they were in and you put somebody else into that situation, of somebody else of similar, experience and background and level of expectation in the role, and you put them into exactly the same situation within the same culture, would they have made the same decision? And if the answer to that question is yes, they probably would have, for all the reasons we've explored, then how can you possibly say it's driver error? How can you possibly say responsibility lies solely with the driver? If the substitution test applies and others would have made the same call based on all facts and situations and circumstances, then the result of that cannot come back to human error or the outcome only being that. So again, that's something else to think about perhaps within your own investigations or how you're exploring this. Think about the substitution test. Would somebody else have made the same call? And quite often the case is probably yes. Okay, right. Let's explore this a little bit then in the context of COMET now, and indeed performance influencing factors. Well known and well understood, as you'll know as well from being COMET customers. For those of you that are, the performance factors that sit within COMET, they're not our own. We didn't make these up. They are absolutely in line with the UK's HSE's guidance around human factors. So again, a lot of this is open source information, and we've just taken some of the findings from those performance influencing factors and related it back to this particular case study. And we've highlighted the ones that really apply here. So again, hopefully familiar with some of these in relation to the task or the job or the work that's been done. We have a range of PIFs that may well apply, and of course, in the context of an investigation, it's really, really important that we do take the time to explore these, because think about what these are. These are the influences or the reasons as to why somebody did what they did or didn't do what they ought to have done, i.e. whatever that human error is, these are the influences that may well have led to that. So you're going to get some answers here. You're going to get some answers here, and it's really important that you're able to get the context of these. So clarity of signs, control signals, fair enough. But in this case, the provision of engineering and technical safety solutions, I touched on the automatic train stop system wasn't in place for this particular track or piece of track. So again, has that had an influence on what's happened? Absolutely. Level of complexity, difficulty, routine, unusual task, but divided attention, task distraction. You bet it. You bet that driver was focused fully on his schedule, the fact he was a few seconds late, and how damaging that would be to the reputation of both him and the rail company that he works for. You've got no doubt that his focus was on that and probably nothing else. And the final one there, the time allowed to complete the task successfully. Well, as I said already, these drivers work to a very tight time schedule, allowing very, very little margin or room for error. And of course, it only takes one delay, one failure that, again, may well be out of their control as well, that's created this knock-on effect. So again, these are all things that ultimately have influenced the incident and indeed the driver behavior on the day. If we look at individual factors, again, more focused around the person involved and the individual. Again, stress, morale. What would that person's mindset? How would they have been feeling? Again, thinking about all we spoke about there, about the stigma of being late, the culture within the organization, the culture within the industry, the expectations of the public and the community. You're in that role and you're running late. Yeah, that driver would have been feeling under a lot of stress. Absolutely no question about it. Time pressure, again, we've touched on certainly through the scheduling, and in fact they were running late. And of course, that probably led to motivation versus other priorities. What was their motivation? It was to get the job done. And it was to get to that next station and try and make up those few seconds. When you think about it, so insignificant, but to make up those few seconds to get to that next station on time. And finally, and again, no surprise that we've got the majority of our performance influencing factors here that sits actually within the broader organization influence. So again, pressure to succeed, output targets versus safety, i.e. production, get the job done versus really thinking about the risk that goes along with that. Was it worth it? Of course not. Is it ever worth it? In this case, certainly not. The quality of supervision, but more in this case, the motivational leadership. So again, the culture within the organization, as I've said, the way they retrain drivers, the way they treated drivers through financial penalties, of course, I'm sure we wouldn't agree with. And of course, that was definitely a factor as to what drove their behavior on the day. We've mentioned the provision of adequate training. They were degraded. They were made to feel bad. They were made to feel shame for being late or having some kind of error on their record. And again, the consequence of failing to adhere to procedures. Well, you can take that in one of two ways. The first way, of course, as we've already spoken about, the fact that where things go wrong, they're completely chastised for that. But also the fact that production over safety was key and the timing was so key for what they were doing, that actually, had that driver made up the time, pushed the limits perhaps, completed an unsafe journey, but had he got that train back on time, would anyone have minded? Would anyone have cared? Probably not. But that's a precursor, and or would have been a precursor to something else happening. And probably, if we were to look at that and go back in time, drivers probably do that all the time. Push the limits a little bit in order to make sure and make up time and not be found to be late or to be wanting. So again, of course, we look back in time, and you could argue that, of course, the bottom one around organizational culture as well would probably come out of this to almost encapsulate everything that we've mentioned. So yeah, from that driver's perspective, we've picked out a handful then of performance influencing factors that undoubtedly would have influenced them on the day. So again, my sort of plea to you all here is, within your own organizations and within your own investigations, whilst thinking about human error, use, and again, this is how COMET's laid out. I'm going to give you a very quick run through that in a moment to remind us all what sits within the system. But let's just remember, how best to go about the understanding of human error. And if we can get to outcomes through our performance factors, which ultimately will signpost us and deliver us, hopefully, accurate root causation, then we have a far better chance of preventing reoccurrence, as opposed to solely focusing on human error. Let's not fix the driver in this case. Let's fix the situation, and let's fix the culture that we find ourselves in. Then you will do a much better chance of eradicating further human error down the line. Okay, so some things to think about then. You need to get into the mind of the individual or the individuals directly involved. So from an investigation standpoint then, we were presented with an issue a few months ago where an organisation wanted help. They reached out to us and they wanted help with their investigations, but they also wanted to understand a little bit more detail why they weren't fully dealing with or preventing human error. And they were getting a lot of reoccurrences. And when we sat down and we spoke to them and we explored how they were currently doing, they weren't a COMET customer, how they were currently doing investigations, how they were currently treating human error, how they were speaking to people. And we asked, so what types of questions do you ask? How do you properly establish what led to the human error? What was going on at the time? No, we don't. We don't do that. We don't speak to people. We don't interview. We don't ask these questions. We get an initial statement and we pretty much deal with it from there. So how could you possibly understand the mindset of those involved, what the thought process was, what the decision-making process was, if you haven't taken the time to go out and speak to them and ask questions, and do that respectfully, but actually try and get to the bottom of what happened? So they were based on investigations on hearsay and no real flatbed of a structure or foundation to fully understand actually what was going on here. So that was a very easy win for us. We'll do better investigations, and go and speak to people, get out there, and you'll soon find out what's going on. Avoid hindsight bias. What on earth were you thinking? That's remember at the time of the incident, as it says at the top there, they would have 9 times out of 10, 99 times out of 100, we do what we think is right. Even if we know we're breaking a rule or not following a procedure, at the time we do that, we probably do it based on because we've done it before and it worked. We can get away with it. We know it's meant to still be safe. It's normalized, right? It's normalized. So people typically are doing what they think is right, or what they know they can maybe, still manage and kind of get away with. So perhaps, we ought to be thinking about that as well. Let's remember about how people were feeling and what they were probably thinking at the time of the incident. So hindsight bias, to be honest with you, in an investigation generally is something that we want to try and avoid. So apply the substitution test, as I've said, to also assess the likelihood of human error. I've touched on that already, so that's something to think about. Investigate from within the tunnel, not outside. Let's not try and deal with everything in one go. Really try and get into the kind of isolation mode. So we want to isolate those human errors from other factors and deal with that as an individual component part of the investigation. And again, that also touches on really trying to get an understanding and the mindset of those involved at the time. So investigate from within the tunnel, not outside. That's a nice tip for you. And of course, blame. Blame has no place in performing human factors analysis. Let's try and eradicate that altogether. Yes, people have to, responsibly, stand up and take responsibility and accountability for actions, particularly where there's maybe some fairly indefensible reasons why it's happened. But let's not go into an investigation or human factors analysis with blame on our mind. All of these little tips and factors we've touched on there are critical to understanding those performance influencing factors that I just touched on a few moments ago. And these sort of almost mindset approaches or investigation approaches that you have, then these will definitely add value to the investigations going forward, if you're serious about it. Okay, just briefly, I'm going to remind us all, particularly those of you that are indeed, of course, COMET users. We are going to talk about the actual process for doing this within COMET. So again, there are 2 steps to identifying effectively human factors and going through a human factors analysis. Phase 1 is to identify those human error COMET factors within your timelines, within your SID grids that directly caused the incident to happen. The second phase is the human factors analysis itself, where we identify the failure. So at what point in time did the incident occur? And then subsequently, as I've already said, we identify those PIFs, those performance influencing factors. So to break that down, when we talk about failure stage identification, the first step is to consider information. Okay, so the questions that you are posed, or what the investigator is posed with and provided guidance around, was there a failure to perceive or notice anything, understand anything, or indeed use that information to forecast? So again, this is about information that we are taking on board. It might be through instructions, briefings, handover, inductions. It might even be written through policies and procedures and instructions and guidance. But it also might be what's out there. So things that we take on board through our senses. So things that we're seeing, things that we're smelling, things that our kind of sixth sense is picking up on. But it's all about our ability as human beings to take on board and effectively process information to then make the right decision on our next course of action. So the first point of call here is, did the human error actually start from the fact that there was a misunderstanding somehow of the information that was being received? If that's not where the initial fault took place, if the investigation determines that actually there were no particular issues with the information, then we move on and we consider, was there a potential issue with the decision-making process? So was there a mistake? So was somebody, who was put into an unfamiliar situation where there was no predefined guidance, instruction, procedure for them to follow, and they ultimately had to make a decision on the best way forward. They had to make a best judgment call on the way forward. And again, perhaps when the investigation takes place, that it was ultimately determined that in fact that maybe just wasn't the best decision to take. But it's hard to be critical of the individual when they're simply using their experience alone. But that would be a mistake. Routine deviation, this is the way we do it around here. It's become normalized. There's no organizational control over it. So although we have some form of a PPIG in place, actually we're regularly breaking the rules. And on this particular day, the unfortunate individual was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Again, it's routine, it's normalized. Is it fair to pinpoint that outcome of that investigation on that individual alone and deal with them? Is that going to eradicate human behavior going forward, or the less desirable human behavior going forward? Probably not, because it's become normalized already. So we have to treat that as more of a systemic issue. And that's very similar, different, but similar to situational deviation. So again, are we seeing decisions to violate a PPIG due to a unique or specific set of circumstances? So actually, again, due to an individual situation that we were in, we decide to do it this way. It might be leadership. It might be certain supervisors or managers are more strict on following procedure than others. And so depending on the shift that you're on or who we're working for, we have a different way of going about things. Therefore, we're not consistent. And of course, that's a dangerous place to be in as well. And the final one there in decision is the one where really we've got to be very, very careful. And we've got to be very, very absolute in terms of when we determine this is a malicious violation. Extreme behavior, indefensible, that cannot be rationally explained, i.e. there was really nothing that the organization could have done to have foreseen or prevented that. And that's really at a point in time where probably, internal performance management would actually kick in. But it may well still be a cause around that human error. So again, we've got to consider the decision-making process. And if an investigation can't uncover an issue with the actual decision that was being made, well, finally, that error must then have happened at the point in time we were actually executing a task or performing an action. So again, lapse, when an action isn't taken when it should have been, or in a slip when an action is performed, but it's performed incorrectly. And again, there's a number of reasons or influences as to why that might have happened. Okay, so again, these are the sort of three steps within the failure stage. It's either going to be an issue with information, the decision, or the action that was actually being taken. And of course, once you determine at what point in time the error took place, almost like that kind of domino effect, you can then move on and determine your performance influencing factors. So again, for the benefit of those of you that are COMET users, you do have the benefit of the Human Factors Guide. It's a help and resource in your app. It's also contained within your various COMET practitioner material, but there's a 20-question guide that is designed to prompt your investigators through the process of human factors analysis to establish any job, individual, or organizational related failing or shortcoming that may well have influenced the human error on the particular day that it took place. So again, a really useful resource to help you start to get to the bottom of where these things happen. So whilst we give you a process and we give you something to follow within the system, let's not forget, you've also got some useful resources to utilize as well. And as a reminder then, I won't go through these in great detail right now because I've already touched on most of these during our case study, but the second phase within human factors analysis, once we've of course determined what point in time the error took place, was it information, decision, or action, we then have to explore our performance factors. So we have our job-related factors to consider. We have our individual-related factors to consider, so far more on the individual themselves or the team involved. And finally, we have the more broader organizational factors, again, taking into account the bigger picture and far more things like culture and kind of normalized behavior and how these things haven't actually been picked up on in the past. So again, that's the breakdown of how it works in COMET. We go through our IDA model and then we navigate through our PIFs. And hopefully by doing that, you get a much richer and better understanding of why that human error occurred. And that gives you a much better entry point to doing your root cause analysis to get the right root causes that can be fixed long term. That's the importance of that interim human factors review. So here's something to take away. I'm going to close out. I'm coming toward the end now. You might be happy to hear, but I'm coming toward the end now. But what I'm going to mention is something actually for you all to take away, something that you can all action and to take away into the workplace tomorrow. And I'm going to talk about error traps. For any of you that are particularly interested in or have an awareness of HOP, human and organizational performance, talks a lot about understanding human error, talks a lot about understanding that from a learning team's perspective and how we can properly learn from past work and good work and how that influences future work. But something that also goes in a lot of detail around is being aware of common error traps. So these are things that will exist more than likely in your organization, in your projects, at your sites, at your locations, on your assets right now that you could probably, if you're being honest, identify. And if you could even deal with one of those error traps and try and eliminate it, you're instantly giving yourself a much better chance of reducing the likelihood of human error. So think about error traps. What rules do we have in place that people don't follow? Because, for whatever reason, it's no longer fit for purpose. It had a reason at one point in time, but now it doesn't. Has it become out of date? Or actually, is it valid? Is it perfectly valid? But people just have now moved on from it so much through that normalized behavior that we don't follow it. So therefore, are we in a risk situation there, a higher risk situation? Are we utilizing or relying on procedures that are, maybe outdated, but actually are too long or complex? People cannot process, there's that people been able to process information 7 plus or minus 2. So if you are overloading operators and workers with too much information, with procedures that expect too much of them, then of course we're just setting people up to fail there. So how easy are our work instructions and our procedures to actually follow? And again, we can break that down as well. Often an underlying cause as to why people get confused or do the wrong thing when they think they're doing the right thing. Perhaps a distractive work environment, so somewhat unusual, not the norm, that makes it very, very difficult for people to focus, to concentrate, to communicate, to pass information, to hear what's going on, to simply be aware of their surroundings properly as well. So what does our actual work environment look like? Time pressures or unrealistic deadlines. So again, a great example we've just explored in our case study, our Japanese case study. Again, what impact does that have on people? Whether it's perceived time pressure or not is something to explore as well. People often have this perception of time pressure, but actually no one specifically has put that on them, but they put it on themselves. Well, does that matter? If we feel the pressure, we feel the pressure. Where does that actually come from? Something to think about as well. Of course, resourcing, under-resourcing for a task or activity, more work with an individual, more likely to take shortcuts naturally. That's what human behavior will do with us. Are indeed, confusing controls and alarms. Again, ergonomics, design, tools, equipment, machinery. How easy, how intuitive are we making the workplace for the individual? Are we ultimately setting people up for success, or are we setting them up for failure? And again, these error traps are things that you can think about and perhaps target within your own organizations. So here's your call to action then. Organize an error hunt. We're not close to Easter yet, so it's not quite an Easter hunt, but we could do an error hunt. Take time out with your team. Have a conversation. What error traps do we think actually exist? Explain what error traps are. I've given you our top 6, and they may well be relevant to your workplace or not, but they will give you a good starting point. And use those examples of PIFs that you've got within COMET already. These are where error traps often, exist. So explain what they are and look at some real workplace examples. And let's challenge ourselves to identify, to proactively identify them and create a plan to mitigate. And if you do that, if you take away an action today to say, I'm going to identify one common workplace error trap that exists, and I'm going to do my best to eradicate it, then you've already taken your first step to reducing the likelihood of human error. Therefore, you are reducing the chances of having an incident. So that's your call to action from today. And if anyone is particularly interested in that, then again, if you research human and organizational performance, Dr. Todd Conklin is the author, then you will get a lot of really useful information about what all of this means as well. My final sign off for today. It's easier to bend a piece of metal than twist an arm. What does that mean? It's easier to bend a piece of metal. Let's not fix the worker. Let's fix the process. Let's fix the design. Let's fix the workplace. You will get a much quicker response and you will have a much safer situation by doing that than if we try and focus on simply changing human error. Yes, you might get short-term knee-jerk reactions, but we will always revert to type in the end. So it's easier to bend a piece of metal than twist an arm. And I will leave that as my final sign-off for today. So thank you very much, everyone. I am just about within my time. I think I've got about 3 minutes to go. So there we are. Hopefully you found that useful. Thank you for taking the time out to join. If you're watching it later on, then thanks for doing that as well. Again, if you want any more information on that, if you're using COMET and you want a bit more information on your on the way that you're doing human factors internally, then you know who I am, you know who we are. Feel free to get in touch. And I really do hope that that you found that beneficial. And I hope that you can all sign up to our final webinar of the year on the 16th about doing good old investigations better from the outset. So I'll be online for 10 minutes still. If you've got any comments, questions, pop them in the chat. I'll soon pick up on them. If not, yeah, thank you very much for your comments. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you all next time.